The kind of applications that I would like to see with AI is using AI-assisted drones for reforestation. If we can have drone kill nets floating over cities, so people are speculating, and there's some insane level of drone production happening in Ukraine right now, what would it take to drive the same level of interest and capital investment in drones to actually restore ecosystems and actually make a difference to the climate question? My sense is there's a lot that could be done there if somehow we conjure the social and political will for it. And then you can go further and actually more fun. Questions around AI for talking to animals and plants. Some work on this has already been done, but these are the kinds of technologies that I would love to see accelerated based on this desire to really feel ourselves as part of that broader web of life, for humanity to remember its place as stewards of natural work.
Greetings, future fossils. I'm Michael Garfield, welcoming you to the podcast that explores our place in time. But this week, I'm talking with Stephen Reid, who describes himself as a transdisciplinary technologist, facilitator, and Dharma student trained in the fields of AI and machine learning, complexity science, physics, transformative coaching, and insight meditation. Quite a cluster to hold together there. We're having this conversation as a kind of pre-game for the course he's teaching very soon on Futurecraft on technological metamodernism, in which I will be guest lecturing along with Hansi Freenacht, Ellie Hain, Rufus Pollock, and Alexander Beiner, exploring the transformative impact of technology on self-culture and society, however you care to define those four categories. Those of you who have followed me for a while know that I consider all of them mutually overlapping and recontextualizing. And that's one of the things that I hope sticks with you after listening to this conversation, because another way of thinking about where we are in time is that a good many people in the early 21st century are confronted by the implications of the non-human turn and the linguistic turn in philosophy, the idea that all knowledge is contextualized, the humility that we have to assume by accepting that our knowledge systems are imperfect and that all of the models we make of reality are in some way flawed or biased. And I think that this is really important now as we craft a new metaphysics together. Actually, probably several different metaphysics living in some kind of ecological balance. What is going to come out of the collapse of technocratic globalism is not going to be a single dominant philosophy or worlding, but an ecology of minds. Whether or not you consider artificial intelligence a mind, it's safe to say that what we're dealing with here now is the population and proliferation of new domains and new information structures, and how we proceed in this matters enormously and depends on our ability to run experiments in massive parallel. If you go back and listen to episode 109 when I interviewed Bruce Damer about the origins of life, life didn't start as a single good idea, but as a web of richly interconnected, fluid identities. And the more that lateral information transfer and the domain of culture assumes priority alongside the horizontal, time-bound information transfer of nature, then it's safe to say that we are also moving into a domain where, when I, for instance, talked to Anna Riedel about bounded rationalism and effective altruism from a critical perspective back in episode 166, or just recently in 223 with Tim Morton, where we explored how evil arises from ideology and teleology, and that the promise of the future lies in radical contingency. All of these conversations are alluding to the fact that we have to approach our visions of the future with unknowing, that what happens is the designoid outcome of evolutionary processes that draw from an extraordinary planet scale biospheric aggregation of minds as contested models, provisional hypotheses about what's really going on. And therefore, as I explore in this conversation with Stephen, taking an axiological approach, deciding on values before we try to encode those values in our technologies, has to face the reality that everyone has a plan, as Muhammad Ali said, until you get punched in the face. Ultimately, it all comes back to the question of who are we anyway? Why is it that we care about the things that we care about? And then not settling on the answers, but truly living those questions. I'm excited to live these questions with you in more depth over the next hour, and again in the ongoing series of essays and forthcoming interviews for Humans on the Loop, which, by the way, I am very glad to announce now has token backing from the Cosmos Institute, as well as O'Shaughnessy Ventures, as well as Imaginal Seeds, bringing me up to about 28% of the funding goal that I have to give a year of full-time work and devotion to this project while somehow raising decent children and caring for my marriage. So yeah, if you care about this work, now is a really good time to show that you care by helping me identify sponsors for Humans on the Loop. Or if you've been on the fence for a while and you have the means, this project is listener supported. I want to thank Kalia Z, Damian Newman, and Max Compton for all recently joining the paid subscriber base. I'm doing all of this work out of faith that the enrichment of a knowledge commons is going to matter more in the long run, but Daddy's got to eat. Enjoy this conversation, like, subscribe, review the show, and be sure to visit the show notes where I have links to the most recent writing and to the upcoming course where you can register and join us in what will assuredly be a much more extensive and provocative discussion. Thanks. Stephen,
hey,
welcome on board. How are you?
Thanks so much. Really good to be here. Yeah, I'm doing really well. Just come back for a run. Feeling good in body and mind.
Excellent. This conversation really could have happened much sooner, but we had a reason suddenly, and that reason is that you're teaching a course on metamodernism and technology. I am figured in that. Alexander Beiner, who I was just chatting with yesterday, is figured in that. Several other interesting people you've looped into this. Assuming no prior knowledge on the part of our audience, I would love for you to bring us down from orbit and into context about who you are, where you come from, what animates you in your work, and why these two things together. Why metamodernism and technology in conjunction?
I've always been able to code. I mean that in the sense that my father worked in IT and I grew up just around computers. So I've been a technologist since a very young age. I studied physics and complexity science at university. And they got very involved in the climate activist movement, actually, having studied some climate science and being like, this sounds pretty bad. Why is no one doing anything about this? And yeah, spent some years in the kind of activist world, and then took a psychedelic for the first time and got very interested in just the notion of inner change or inner-led change. Started the UK Psychedelic Society, and that's part of a not-for-profit worker cooperative I still work with called Symbiota. But since 2020, I've gone back to my technology roots in a way, both creating the Dandelion platform for events and co-created gatherings and running courses on mostly on technology topics through that platform. And so the latest course that I'm offering is indeed Technological Metamodernism. Somewhere along the way, I discovered integral theory and then, and the work of Hansi Freinacht or Hansi's version of metamodernism as a kind of more recent take on integral theory, and been involved in that scene since about 2018. I actually met my partner at the Emerge conference in Berlin in 2021, who's Swedish and lives in Sweden. And that's why I'm currently speaking from Stockholm. In the beginning of this year, I moved to Sweden to be with her here. And as I was mentioning to you just before the recording started this morning, I was meeting Thomas Bjorkman, who's another mover and shaker in this kind of meta-modern world, who has big plans for a meta-modern monastery in the south of Stockholm. That's a little bit about my background, at least. Yeah.
So it seems like it was a natural thing for you to work at the intersection of your philosophical interests and your technological interests.
Right.
But why this? Why now? You and I have connected on the fact that the technical has leapt out far ahead of the more kind of human dimensions, that we've become preoccupied with enhancing our capacity to do things. And arguably, like Alan Kay says this on the homepage for Viewpoints Research Institute, says we've got nuclear technologies and Stone Age brains. Another way of putting it is that the Ian McGilchrist frame is something like, once you realize that you can do things more and more efficiently, the reward for that tends to outcompete the reward to think more deeply.
Yeah.
And I was just on a call with an angel investor who said, convincing people that they ought to think more carefully about technology is often a losing battle. That the grain of society is into a shorter attention span and a narrower horizon. So is this the pain that you're trying to address here? Or?
Well, I would say convincing tech entrepreneurs to think more carefully about technology is often a losing battle. But fortunately, society is not made up exclusively of tech entrepreneurs. Yeah, the rest of us are entitled to an opinion on these matters and can actually exercise some power there, not least through legal regulation and state intervention. And there are other possible avenues for intervention, which maybe we'll come onto, that I think at least as interesting and hopeful. But so some of the key inspirations for this course, the work of Daniel Schmachtenberger, who tells a story very similar to the one you were just laying out there. And yeah, his work on axiological design and the third attractor, maybe we'll come onto that. Vitalik Buterin's DAC, or Defensive Decentralized Accelerationism, which he put out there as a response to EAC, this effective accelerationism, which is, as far as I see it, is quite naive, like gung-ho techno-optimism. It was also, Hansi Preynacht has been a constant influence since I came across the Listening Societies back in 2018 time, just putting out this very provocative, cheeky, meta-modern perspective, which I've grown quite familiar with. I haven't seen explicitly applied to technology. And then as we go further into the course, one of the main influences would be Josh Schrei, who I know you've done some work with, and this incredible podcast, what's it called? So You Want to Be a Sorcerer in the Age of Mythic Powers. It just blew so many people away. And I think there's a lot there that some of which we'll touch on in the course. But the core of this course really is linking these three thinkers, Hansi, Daniel, and Vitalik, in a way that I don't believe has been done before. I'm not even sure they really even know about each other. But I believe axiological design framework is an example of metamodern technology or technological metamodernism, and then as a framework. And then I believe Vitalik's DAC is a simple and entry-level attempt to apply a more like values-driven approach to technology that resulting in some quite interesting and provocative suggestions. Now, I think there's plenty more work to be done on how exactly we can apply a kind of metamodern technology framework or axiological design framework, and to work out what kinds of technologies actually fall out of that. But I think I'm suggesting that some of that work is already starting to happen. And I would actually love to get to the point where we might jam on that, even us two today, to contemplate, what other values would we like to see embedded in our technologies, and what kind of technologies would result from those values.
Yeah, you know that I have this whole other applied project, Humans on the Loop, that is concerned with this. But like one of the things what's come up again and again, and just to make sure that we're not playing insider baseball here, one of the things that comes up again and again is I see there being two different ways to think about who the audience is for something like this. And with that work, I've taken the assumption that we live in such a large, complex, techno-social infrastructure, nested embeddings. There's this sense I want to interrogate that we are the makers. Steve Jobs has that fantastic letter that he wrote not long before his death about all of the different ways in which he is dependent on other people. He didn't invent object-oriented programming. He doesn't grow his own food. And so something about this inclines me to disabuse people of where I see an emphasis that you just made on embedding our values in technology, in the process of innovation, in the coding of society, and paying more attention to the ways in which we are already constrained, in the ways that which even somebody who invents something really amazing and world-shifting, that thing still drops into a really diverse ecosystem of millions and millions of other things that over which they have no control.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of what I'm curious about with you is to look at the sort of figure eight here between, when Bio Como La Fe, I want to look at this idea of design and suggest that the agency of our technologies play a much larger role in the work that we think we are doing to make choices.
Yeah.
And so there's a sense in which, we have some say in things, but often that say is in the ways that we are using the tools that have already been made for us. When there's that whole thing, again, Apple computers, they give you an iPad and they're you can do anything with this. It's not really, as Cory Doctorow points out, Apple is really fond of digital rights management and locking various potential functions of this device to make it user-friendly. All of that creative activity is happening within a very narrow channel of what is actually possible. I feel just to hear you riff on the relationship between these two things. One is figuring out how to embed our values in technology is important, but also learning to exercise our values within what is in fact a very limited range of freedom, given all of the interactions of all of the other things over which we have no control.
Yeah, there's certainly a reciprocal relationship between technology and humanity, or technology and values. My favorite example, which I heard from Daniel Schmachtenberger on this, would be to go all the way back to the plow. And his suggestion is that prior to the plow, most human societies had animistic beliefs and had a relatively respectful view towards nature as a kind of sacred being. Even if you were going out hunting and you were killing an animal, there was maybe some moment of recognition and connection of the life you were about to take. Then the plow came along, the first agricultural technologies. And if you're having to whip an ox all day in the hot sun to get it to pull up soil so that you can put your seeds in, it's very difficult, he suggests, to maintain a worldview of the sacredness, non-human life, and this sense of respect towards animals in the context of clearly causing that animal suffering. So that was the technology that then dissolved this animist worldview and actually shifted in a profound way the relationship between humans and animals, or and working animals at least. So no doubt there is a reciprocal relationship. And then that, of course, there's an evolutionary perspective on that as well, because that changing values then affects the next technology that we might, contemplate, or the next set of values we might consider embedding in our future technologies. And the other thing that came to mind is this idea that technologies actually, we're asking that word to do a lot of work. So the Consilience project, that Daniel's project, talk about actually a civilizational tech stack where we talk about tools, human scale artifacts, technologies, We can think of things like sets of tools that are complicated enough to require engineering. So water wheel, steam engine, light bulb, refrigerator, ecologies of technologies, infrastructures, which was actually multiple different ecologies of technologies, and then whole technological epochs. Yeah, there's both that kind of like reciprocal take and also this sense of like technologies existing in a whole ecology, which we have to be mindful of and respectful of in the context of contemplating how we might wish to embed a value or some of our values in a particular technology.
So when you say, for those who are not steeped in Schmachtenberger's work, when you're talking about the axiological component of that, give people a little more framing here.
Yeah, sure. It's to talk about axiological design, it's worth first going through three maybe more familiar forms of design. And we can relate those to the different developmental stages in the kind of metamodern framework for folks that might be familiar with that. Daniel talks about naively optimistic design. So this is the techno-optimist take that positive values are inherently encoded in technology. And just simply by making more technology, the world gets better because technology is inherently good. So this came about around the Enlightenment, like Renaissance period, I would suggest, and carried on through the Industrial Revolution. It's a kind of modern, or it arose in the modern worldview in the like kind of language and metamodern theory. I would actually say we're now experiencing a kind of a reversion to it in a way with the EAC and similar philosophies. Because people can feel something isn't quite right here. Something isn't quite right with our relationship with technology. And it's unsurprising that some people's reaction to that, let's just go back to the last good thing, the last thing that worked, which is just believing that like technology is just good and let's just do more of it and as fast as possible. However, there was a reaction even at that time to the kind of naively optimistic perspective, which was Ludditism, a movement of people that said, hey, technology is taking our jobs and all terms of like degrading the quality of our life by making us work like long and unhappy hours. Actually, in a way, what the suggestion was there that negative values of some kind were embedded into technology. Technology is inherently bad, and that our lives get better through designing technology out of our lives as much as possible. Now, we could call that maybe a kind of like early postmodern like reaction to technology, and then a kind of a late postmodern reaction, which is, I would suggest, where most people at this point is nihilistic design in Daniel's language. And nihilistic design comes up with this very common line, like that technology is not good or bad. Technologies are neutral. It's all about how we use them, or that determines whether positive and negative things come from it, or perhaps technologies are only as good or bad as the people who use them, and that it's values. Technology doesn't include values of any kind. Like the fields of technology and value are like strictly separate. So it's meaningless to talk about value and technology. And this is backed up, sometimes at least, by the kind of postmodern flavored take of just saying what even is value? Aren't all values just socially constructed anyway? So basically, we could, in one way or another, we can just forget this question and just leave it up to the people that are using these technologies to work out what to do with them. Yeah, Daniel's suggesting that all of those are deficient in various ways. And as a response, he proposes axiological design. So axiology is the study of value. And the suggestion is that no, absolutely, technology can have values embedded in it, can certainly act to change our values in a not necessarily obvious, but like relatively foreseeable way if we take the time to sit and think about it. If you had taken the time to sit and think about how might a plow change your attitude towards animals, you probably could have figured that out. And similarly, if we had spent more time thinking about how might a social media change our relationship to offline connection and body image and you name it, we probably could have figured that out too. But we didn't even take the time. So it's really, in a way, he's just calling for just take the time. Axiology says, let's seriously sit down and think about what kind of values might be embedded in this technology, how that technology might go about changing our values. And yeah, these fields are not separate. They are conjoined. To imagine that they are separate is a kind of immature approach, or even a kind of form of, it can be a kind of get out clause for folks that may actually realize, have a good sense of how their chosen technology might change society. And it's very convenient for them to say, oh, it's all about who uses them. Yeah, the essence of axiological design is really taking the time to dig into this question of how technology will alter our value.
So with all debt paid to that kind of a project, something that Daniel himself says is that if in a game theoretical condition he's fond of operating in, if you show restraint, if you stop to think, if you try to code wisdom or reflection into your operation as an organization, then all other things being equal, you lose ground. You are outcompeted to the sociopaths. Like you lose to the organizations or the individuals that do not show this restraint.
Mm-hmm.
Again, while that may be true in one layer with no top-down regulation, really what he's saying is this is why market dynamics don't rule everything, or why markets eventually evolve states or cultural norms, that like this tripartite structure in which you have the market, the state, and the civil society is a sort of existential complication of that kind of problem. It's what allows us to think past it.
Well,
but nonetheless, he says, to the degree that things are being ruled by markets, we can't take the time to think in this way. And something that comes up again and again for me in talking with people about the prospect of a wisdom economy, of a devising economic systems that aggregate and average their rewards calculus over multiple different timescales that allow us to leave room for play and scholarly activity and so on, is you have to be able to show that it does actually confer benefit in the long run. So that's one thing that I'd like to hear you reflect on. The other thing is, and maybe I'm cynical about this, coming out of complex systems discipline, the notion that we can place responsibility on an inventor to spend polynomial time, any amount of time, on thinking through the consequences of their invention is absurd.
Yeah.
Because there's this, you're up there in Sweden with Nora Bateson, Dave Snowden, these people are very fond of reminding us that human complexity is something that cannot ever be totally modeled, that it can't be perfectly predicted, and that by creating systems that do better and better jobs of predicting that kind of human behavior, those are new agents in a complex economy that then throw that calculus out. Like that you end up in Brian Arthur's evolutionary algorithm simulations where everything is just getting smarter and smarter, trying to model and predict everybody else's activity. But then the smarter the other contributors to a system, the greater a burden it places on your own smarts, and that there's like a ratchet here that doesn't stop until maybe it runs up against the natural limits of that system and something has to give. And there's like a collapse of some kind that right sizes that arms race to a level where it can actually subsist on the available resources. So like, those are like the two kind of challenges there. They're reflected in one another. Is as noble as it is to encourage people to take an axiological approach to technology. We have on the one side the fact that your competitors won't, unless they're being forced to by a legally enforced charter or a military or whatever. And then on the other hand, you have the fact that even given the freedom to spend an effectively unlimited amount of time thinking about this stuff, really maybe the best we can do is effect better tools for community oversight and release these things into the wild and then police ourselves and learn as we go.
Mm-hmm.
That this is not something that even somebody with a galaxy brain like Daniel can sit there and be like, yes, the plow. The last thing I'll say about it is that my buddy JF Martel on Weird Studies, he made this point about the car, right? That it was easy to see that the internal combustion engine was getting us from place to place faster. It was not at all obvious at first that in a kind of Stafford beer, a system is what it does, functional sense over a longer time scale, that you could argue that what an internal combustion engine is an engine for injecting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so there are horizons that are enforced on us on our ability to compute these things in multiple different ways. And that's my challenge to axiological design. I'd love to hear you speak to.
Yeah, sure. I don't think anyone who's endorsing axiological design would be denying the fact that, and this is still really complicated, and that there's many emergent phenomena that are happening here. We get as well as thinking carefully, as doing our best, think carefully about how this might change society. Absolutely, we should also have community oversight, adopt this more Snowden-esque approach to just sensing into the changes, like actually talking to people on the ground about this is how we thought it was going to change things. Is it actually changing things in the way that we thought, and so on. But I think the claim is like to say that, it's all just really complicated, so let's not even try, is an absurd denial of responsibility and like the human capacity for intelligence and imagination. And it's a far too easy get out of jail card for many individuals, corporations perhaps, that would very much like to just not have to think about this. It's a both and approach, I'd say, for that. But my sense is that quite often that you can actually make the argument we haven't even really tried seriously over the past few decades to do this. So like in a way, we don't really know how well it's going to work. But the externalities from our current technological epoch are such that I would suggest it's clear we need to try something different. And this has the right smell to me in a way. Now, the other piece we mentioned, and doesn't this require someone with a legal charter or military or yes, it is part. Yeah. And so it's a part of what I see in that axiological design, or what falls out of axiological design, is a call to as a kind of like a re-empowerment of the state's role in regulating technologies. And again, that's not easy, and like the state is going to get things wrong, and it is going to be difficult for the state to keep up. But none of those are reasons why we shouldn't do it, or shouldn't be asking the state to play some role in checking the power of, for example, powerful AI companies that are driven by this Molochian dynamic. But I also think that and this is where it actually gets most interesting to me, that the other ways of binding these power games. So, for example, guilds and societies. And so could one imagine something like the Eleusinian mysteries, which was, as far as I understand, outside of the Greek proto-state as it existed, but still seemed to have such an important role in society that was clearly shepherding some kind of powerful technology. In that case, it was some kind of psychoactive technology rather than a silicon one. But through a seemingly quite complex set of rituals and behaviors, that technology was kept in to a certain community, didn't spill outside of that community to do potential further harms. I'm very curious about the role of guilds or things like them, and it's actually one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because this is. I imagine this is something that you might have covered in a way in the AI and embodied ethics course, given that you've been jamming with Josh a little bit on that. So do you have any thoughts on that piece?
Okay, so I've been thinking a lot about the actual nature of the digital and the way that it affords scalability. I just wrote this piece for Eon about carcinization and thinking about the everything becomes a crab meme as it's like a joke on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's speaking to something that is very deeply true about evolution, which is that evolution is a metabolic process and that it seeks efficiency. It seeks lower energy expenditure wherever possible. It seeks risk mitigation in some sense. You can say that the crab is a kind of an emblem or a symbol of our relationship to technology in that it has a shell and it has periscope eyes that it uses to sense through that shell, and that it has the claws, which is like the extension of its leverage. But one of the reasons that I feel like the carcinization meme succeeded during COVID was that cancer, the crab, etymologically has the same root as cancel, which is to cross out, that the crab claw, and to cancel by scratching something into a surface is also connected etymologically to the chart, to Descartes and Cartesian logic, the grid. Like Descartes being someone who inherited a quartered plot of land and then went on to quarter the entire surface of the planet with his system, which, according to the angelic vision he supposedly received, was an effort to unify, which is to homogenize or to make fungible. The reason that it works to grant leverage over the natural world and to unify mathematical systems and so on is precisely because it removes things from their context. Descartes was a big fan of vivisection. And again, to that McGilchrist kind of way of seeing the left hemisphere as that which regards every other agent in the world as a non-player character, as a soulless automaton. And there's, I guess you can talk about, again, this sort of predatory or exploitative mode in which those kinds of rites of passage are jettisoned because there's, again, this, like Daniel's concern is that they're standing in the way of, if you look at the last 100 years of the evolution of lifestyle consumerism and the ongoing erosion of eldership in society, and this tendency in the modern West to fixate on youth and productivity. And I think the reason that we see these kinds of systems emerge in certain societies has something to do with those societies having been around for long enough to realize that to take things out of context only gets you so far. And so I want to turn this back to you, because this is where the metamodern piece comes back in, right? This is where not just taking a postmodern turn and understanding the linguistic basis for fact or understanding the situatedness of knowledge matters, but also understanding the shared context upon which we can start to reconstruct systems that allow us to grant people more agency based on accumulated life experience, or that recognize through like Web3 style systems like quadratic voting that this is like a fundamentally scientific enterprise in that we can start to decompose like the democratic, like the tyranny of the majority in democracy is because it regards one vote as equal to another vote. Mm-hmm. And rather than saying maybe some people deserve more votes, which is what we get with capitalism and the uneven distribution of capital gain, we can say maybe a more heterogeneous population of votes that evinces that this position is anchored in a more objective basis, because like science, the so-called third person position transcends an intersubjective agreement between two people by pulling in someone else with different cultural biases. So like this question of what rites of passage might look like in the age of AI, I think it's attached to all of this stuff, but I'm actually curious to know how you're actually making sense of all of this and why specifically you personally have turned to metamodernism as an instrument through which to deepen our sense of how to make and use technologies. I hope that's not like a dodge.
No, there's a few things there. Firstly, on the rites of passage and kind of initiatory cultures piece, I think it's to say that, wouldn't it be great if we could bind the behavior of, say, powerful AI companies through having some kind of guilds that send members through some kind of important ritual or rite of passage, such that people are so motivated and they're nourishing and important and meaningful to the people that are part of them, that they're not going to do the bad stuff because they're so motivated to stay in the guild. So I'm not saying that's a silver bullet either. Questions like, what can we start to look at? So yes, we should start to look at state regulation more carefully, and how we can upskill states to be able to better regulate technology. And also, could we look at things like guilds with rites of passage as an alternative? We don't really know which one is going to work out best. Maybe it will be different in different countries for different technologies. However, I do think you can make a very strong argument that how the hell are we expecting rites of passage to make any kind of difference in the tech world if even our teenagers don't have rites of passage? Rites of passage have just been lost to such a great extent throughout the Western world, at least. Probably the first step is actually just ensuring that our kids get good rites of passage as they make their way into adulthood, and just the general population at other kind of major moments of transition in life. Bill Plotkin's work on soulcraft and the journey of soul initiation is really fantastic on this. That isn't a simple one. There's actually a whole very beautiful conversation about rites of passage in society more generally, I would suggest there. But I think there is something there ultimately. Now, the kind of meta-modern flavor to this is to say something that already has a meta-modern flavor to it is to say, okay, it's naive techno-optimism. On one hand, we've got the kind of Luddite or nihilistic postmodern perspectives on the other. What is the position that transcends and includes both of those things? For me, axiological design has this meta-modern flavor to it, which is to say technology isn't always good, but it isn't always bad either. And yes, it could have positive benefits to society if we really think about it hard. But then the kind of more interesting meta-modern twist, I would say, is, what is the application of axiological design? What kinds of technology, or first of all, what kinds of values are worth embedding into technology? And then furthermore, what kinds of technologies would result from those kind of values? Because it isn't axiological design and kind of meta-modern technology is technological position is not saying, and let's not build anything. Let's strictly constrain the further development with the power of the state and these guilds or whatever. It's saying, no, absolutely. Yes, let's build stuff, but let's build stuff in a really thoughtful way. This is what I mentioned, Vitalik Buterin. He's a co-founder of Ethereum and his DAC philosophy. And this, I would suggest, is a kind of application of axiological design, though I'm not sure he would see it in that way. The D stands for defensive or decentralized or differential accelerationism. And in the post, he's certainly more techno-optimist than me, a lot more, certainly much more than Daniel. There's no doubt about that. He really makes a strong case of technology having improved people's lives in all kinds of ways, but then says, climate change. That seems to be a pretty huge failure of the market and the kind of techno-optimist perspective that doesn't seem like it's getting solved anytime soon through the current paradigm. And also he's clearly concerned about AI risk. So just to quote him, actually, he says, to me, the moral of the story is often this. Often it really is the case that version N of our civilization's technology causes a problem and version N+1 fixes it. However, this does not happen automatically and requires intentional human effort. It is intentional action coordinated through public discourse and culture, shaping the perspectives of government, scientists and philanthropists, and not an inexorable techno-capital machine that solves these problems. So that you can see there, actually, the way in which he's saying intentional action coordinated through public discourse has this kind of axiological flavor to it. It's, yes, let's make tech, but let's really talk about it and be careful with it. And actually then what he comes up with is a set of technologies that are really rooted in the value of sovereignty, I would say is probably the best word to describe it. And he divides these into the world of bits and the world of atoms. In the world of atoms, he talks about a micro defense and macro defense. In the world of bits, he talks about cyber defense and info defense. I can get more into any of those if you're interested. But this is the point at which, we're saying there are actually technologies that are worth building, that are in service to values that we really do cherish on reflection. And we can be relatively confident that these technologies are not going to introduce more damaging externalities if anything, we'd like to have a hunch that they are synergistic satisfiers, in Daniel's language, that they are more likely than not to have positive externalities, positive knock-on benefits, that even if we can't be sure until we see them in the wild.
So let's look at a case study then, because you brought up cybersecurity.
Okay, so actually, I'll briefly go through all four of the ones that I mentioned, actually, because I think it's instructive. In the world of atoms, he talks, so when he's talking about micro-defense, the main technology he's advocating for is decentralized vaccine production and ways of cleaning the air. He says that the vaccine debate was so toxic essentially because of the amount of power the state had in it. The state was the only actor capable of coordinating the production of the vaccines and then could further mandate that people took them. But imagine a world where instead, like everyone can actually just print a vaccine in their own home, including to like novel biological threats. It would really change the conversation there. And is clearly offers this defensive aspect against a threat which many people are very concerned with, including in the age of AI and the potential for AIs to be able to produce novel pathogens in the hands of people that might seek to do harm. The macro defense is mainly pointing to resilient physical infrastructure and decentralized physical infrastructure, such as decentralized energy generation, decentralized ways of growing food. Again, the kind of part of the context from this is COVID. And why was COVID so bad? Because it disrupted supply chains, and like everything we rely on depends on supply chains. However, if everyone could still get on the internet and produce their own energy and could and had enough and could feed themselves just in their own communities, that wouldn't have nearly been such a problem there. In the world of bits, so cyber defense, I guess this is the one you asked for. So the kind of main issue in terms of cyber defense is the concentration of technological power in the hands of very few companies that then, even if they say they're not going to, or they say they don't want to, or at least if a government asks them to, like, will I hand over your messages or hand over your emails and so on at the first request, it seems like. So what kind of technologies can actually just mean that isn't possible, even in principle? It's things like blockchains, fully secure, decentralized data storage systems, such that even in principle, it's not possible for the state, for example, or it could be some kind of other malicious actor to obtain private data from individuals. The final category is in the world of bits, this info defense. Here, the main issue that he's thinking of is essentially truth finding and misinformation. And so an example that he cites approvingly is community notes, which possibly you know a little bit about how it works. A really interesting algorithm, actually, that I understand YouTube are about to roll out something similar as well. That essentially, if you're seeing a community note on a tweet, you're seeing not something that's just been voted up by the most people. You're seeing something that has the most consensus amongst people between people from different political perspectives. And so, that's some of the details about the kind of defensive technologies, all in different ways, in defending against different kinds of contemporary threats that Vitalik would love to see more work on.
I'd like to speak to irony and post-irony, or rather, I would like you to speak to irony and post-irony. Because when you have Emil on this, the sort of less public-facing half of Hansi Freenacht in this conversation. I've had conversations with Daniel Geritz. One of the things that keeps coming up in his work and came up in our conversation is this humility. And I guess you mentioned this earlier when we were talking about we can't expect to do this perfectly, but we must still try. When I was on Parallax with Daniel and Tom and Mark, we talked about how this shows up in the kind of the ethos of Star Trek, right? That it's not the participation in Starfleet is a commitment to a set of values, even though you are aware that those values are chosen, and even though you are aware that those values are enacted imperfectly. The prime directive is one of the things that characterizes the Prime Directive is that it's constantly violated because the Kirk or Picard or whomever have to make decisions on the ground that they don't have the luxury of time to check against with Starfleet control in San Francisco. And I'm very curious how you personally make sense of ways that irony and its cousin compromise fit into the way that metamodern approach to technology operates at the level of the individual. And feel free to give concrete stories if you want about surprising yourself or about finding yourself in a position of unintended consequences or this. I feel like we can't do this work without a sense of humor or a bit of self-deprecation. And that's something that's missing in so much of the effective altruist or effective accelerationist dialogue, is that these are areas. It's also true among decentralists. These are areas where ideology rules. And that doesn't seem like it's going to get us where we're hoping to go.
So a couple of things come to mind. Firstly, at the grandest level, I think there is a huge irony in realizing that actually externalities of modern technology for generations assumed to be so minor as to be insignificant. We are now realizing in many ways we're actually the main player all along. And actually the main thing we were producing through our technologies was actually intense ecological and psychosocial externalities. And we didn't quite see that because there's a time delay. But at some point, the clock was always ticking, and at some point the alarm's going to go off. And we're going to have to reckon with the fact that all of the convenience that we've enjoyed through modern technology is going to seem like an absolute joke relative to the inconvenience that we might be facing down the line, unless we start thinking about technology in a very new way. So I think there's a certain there. As a more personal anecdote, I guess I talk about the ACT. I would guess I was on PsyAC, psychedelic accelerationism for a time, from founding the UK Psychedelic Society in 2014, and for those first years at least, really believing this is it. It's psychedelics that are going to solve all of our problems. You just give people this magic pill. They have this overwhelming sense of unity and interconnectedness. This mystical type experiences. They awaken to the unity of all things, and that is going to fundamentally alter their worldview in service of freedom and compassion. And it's turned out to be a lot more complicated than that. And to be honest, I would have known, and I should have known if I had more elders around me at that time. But how I was accessing psychedelics at that time was using cryptocurrency through the dark net, without any kind of elder context or certainly indigenous stewardship to guide my use and thinking around them. And I've got my ass kicked plenty of times in that context. And then nowadays I feel extremely grateful to have found elders and indigenous communities that I've worked with that ironically have helped me to see, that led me to the opinion that the best attitude towards spreading the word about psychedelics is to say almost nothing at all, and just allow them to just do their work and find the right people at the right times in the right ways. And that more or less any shouting about the kind of transformation, and certainly about how much profit they might be able to make this new wave of psychedelic corporations is ends in tears. So that's been a big turnaround from being a very kind of public advocate, noisy advocate for psychedelics 10 years ago. And then to add a touch of humor into things. So we've heard about EAC, DAC. I want to advocate or coin a new meme on that I thought of just earlier today, actually, which is the kind of acceleration, or let's start with the level of values. And value is an interesting thing because you're entitled to yours and I'm entitled to mine. I would we can disagree about these things. And so I think that, like, the question of value is a deeply personal one. There's a fantastic organization called the Meaning Alignment Institute, led by Joe Oderman and Ellie Hain and others, that are doing really interesting work on using AI to help people uncover what they truly value. Because I would suggest a lot of people haven't really thought about it. Probably you have. You're a deep thinker. I've thought about it a bit as well. But like the conversations about value are like not nearly as widespread in society and politics as I would like. But a value that I hold is the kind of sanctity of biological life, if you like. You can find EAC people that are like actually fairly ambivalent to biological life. Whatever, if the next iteration is just silicon and hardware, so be it. Who gives a shit?
Or just a means to an end. God. Yeah.
I'm just saying, for me, I choose to find some sacredness and meaning in biological life. And so to that end, I would like to see TREAC, like accelerationism, to the ends of actually, most broadly, like restoring the ecosphere. And there are the kind of applications that I would like to see talking about with AI is using AI and AI-powered drones, AI-assisted drones for reforestation. If we can have like drone kill nets like floating over cities, some people are speculating, and we can and there's like some insane level of drone production like happening in Ukraine right now. What would it take to drive the same level of interest and capital investment in drones to actually restore ecosystems and actually make a difference to the climate question? My sense is there's a lot that could be done there if somehow we conjure the social and political will for it. And then you can go further and actually more fun. Questions around AI for talking to animals and plants. Some work on this has already been done, but these are the kinds of technologies that I would love to see accelerated based on this desire to really feel ourselves as part of that broader web of life, for humanity to remember its place as stewards of natural work.
And maybe this is a question for Ellie, and I'm glad that you've woven her into this program, that she's on the faculty. It's funny because it's a problem. We've been dancing around this a lot on this call in one way or another. There's the common complaint that we've created these incredibly powerful tools, and what are people doing with them? They're sharing cat memes, they're watching porn, they're binge watching Netflix or whatever. We assume that helping people think about their values, we assume that helping people ask themselves what they want and bring that into focus is going to give us the reward of a society of people that care about the things we hope they care about. But your question about the role of rites of passage and about the social container within which all of this stuff is happening, it's a question of what if 95% of people interact with this kind of a mirror and come away being like, it turns out that my most deeply held values are that I win. It's not necessarily going to be trees. It could be. So like part of what I've been butting my head against in all of this is not just AI as a tool for self-discovery, and certainly not in the way that Doug Rushkoff critiques social engineering through design, saying you've already lost the moral battle because you're trying to influence people in opaque. How can these tools, rather than nudge people in a social engineering way into a desired value system, how can we use them to make the complexity of the environment in which they actually operate more transparent, given the fact that environmental complexity, like we were talking about earlier with these arms races, functions as a developmental driver, right? Like the whole notion of the self-authoring, modern, value-driven person rather than the pre-modern person who's just trying to do well within the value system that they've inherited. People like Harvard psychologist Robert Keegan point to the emergence of transcontinental and transoceanic trade, that the exposure to other cultures as part of what led people to ask about what they actually care about in the first place.
Yeah.
But we have this problem, which is that the way that algorithms are being deployed now has been famously critiqued as reifying the filter bubble. It's like undoing that work in a way. It's giving you what you already want rather than creating the conditions where you are prompted to reflect on that which you do not already know about yourself. Or I guess you see what I'm getting at here, right?
Yeah.
Like we're back at that same question where we started about axiological design and how it is that we can reward a system that actually requires more work on the part of people to reflect and not just decide, hey, what I like is Amazon Prime Day.
Yeah, I think it's an important point that and there's many technologies that like you might hope they're going to do one thing, but if you fail to consider adequately the context and psychosocial environment into which they're being launched, they could turn out in a completely different way. I think Joe and Elliot, Meaning Alignment Institute, are doing some really interesting work. It makes me think of Center for Humane Technologies piece around, we really fucked it up with social media. This is our second chance. Let's not fuck it up again. And Meaning Alignment are actually, they got a very large grant from OpenAI and are connected with some like really top people at OpenAI. So let's hope that they manage to steer something in the right direction there. And that tool does become a useful way of uncovering people's deeper values. However, absolutely, I would suggest that in any case, that's going to be probably a relatively minor part of this process of the discovery of deeper values. And that makes me think of Josh Schreier's work. And I'm actually planning to do his Mythic Body course, this year-long course in ritual and nature connection. That's a question that I'm interested in is like, how do we just get people outside more? How do you give people access to nature more and time and the ability to just connect with something much simpler and more ancient? And it's through those kinds of experiences. Maybe in an ideal world, you can add some psychedelics here or there. I'm reminded of Aldous Huxley's Island. If you remember this, where like it's when the teenagers come of age, they actually take themselves up into the wilderness with what sounds like magic mushrooms, and they co-create like a mushroom ceremony as a group of teenagers, and they come back as initiated adults into this like psychedelic culture. But even without the moksha medicine, like even just the nature immersion would be a good start at least. So what can we do to encourage that? Because in my experience, speaking personally, it is those experiences of nature connection that then have shifted my values and what I care about and led me to the point in which I'm willing to say, yes, a core value for me is the sanctity of biological life. Yeah, if we're just going to ask people what they care about in the absence of also having some plan of giving people new and different ways of experiencing themselves vis-a-vis the natural world, then probably we are just going to get a set of what you and I might think is quite shallow values. So it has to be as part of a larger picture here.
So that's actually funny because one of the things, asking for a friend, given the fact that it comes home to roost in the fact that you are selling this course, something that I talk about a lot with people working in these spaces is that we face a challenge akin to the challenge that like you're not going to come to a therapist unless you realize you have a problem. And I'm curious if you are experiencing any kind of juicy generative friction in explaining the utility of a course like this.
Yeah.
And who are those people and what do you think is going to change their minds? Or do you think that trying to convince people of the relevance of this thing is pointless? Because I'll just say that over the years, I've spent a lot of time, be it in Ken Wilber's scene or in Evolver.net or at SFI, where there's a tension inherent in the narrative that these organizations or these social movements have about themselves, which is on the one hand, they say, this is happening. This is the direction in which the evolution of consciousness is moving or the direction in which science is moving. And then on the other hand, there is this sense that we are at the growing tip of this, that we have a responsibility to push this river in some way. And they don't seem terribly compatible to me. It's suggesting that this is going to happen whether or not we exist. And yet we must do this, that we have a moral imperative. And when I think about trying to convince people that meditating on issues of meaning making or of the derivation of personal significance, precisely because our technologies have remixed space and time and the life cycle of a person, and like meditation technologies that used to be reserved for people in their 50s are now being practiced by people in their 20s in order to give them a competitive edge in the workplace. Like, we have this jumble where you can make the case that understanding matters of significance matters more to survival and success.
Mm-hmm.
And you can argue that maybe the more crazy, unstable, turbulent, VUCA things become, the more people are just going to realize the value of this. Like that, the fact that we have an epidemic of trauma in this world, and also we have this proliferation of people that are actively seeking out counseling and coaching and these kinds of services. Nonetheless, it still seems like a minority position. And I guess I just wonder, to what extent are you making an effort to reach people who don't get it?
Mm-hmm.
And to what extent has crashing the prow of this ship up against the rocks of, like you said, that sort of techno venture capitalist mindset or the goldfish consumer mindset?
Well,
what have you learned from all of that?
Yeah. A much greater number of people that are just familiar with, say, Daniel's work or Hansi's work or Vitalik's work than people that are familiar with all three. So I'd say in the primary audience for the course is people that might be familiar with one of those thinkers and noticed, or at least in Hansi's case, that there hasn't been much written about technology specifically. And here's a chance to encounter some other thing, well, Josh as well. And then, of course, all the people that are actually joining us on the course, other people that are carrying some perspectives that people might not have been previously exposed to. I'm quite well connected in the kind of whole Web3 blockchain space, for example. And actually, and on that topic, I entered Technological Metamodernism to the Open Civics Collaborative Research Match Funding Round. And that the project finished top. So it should actually be getting like a healthy amount of match funding, which in exchange for that match funding, I'm going to open source all of the notes and all of the videos from the course. So that is another thing that will mean that has the potential to reach larger numbers of people. It's not just going to be locked away behind some paywall. And in the earlier part of what you said was, it's just, who do we think we are is what I heard. Who do I think I am? Who do we think we are that we can make any difference to this inexorable techno-capitalist machine? Phrase that Vitalik. I think for me, the kind of meta-modern position there is to really move towards just the fascination and the awe and the wonder and the curiosity that maybe ACK folk are like maybe a little bit too keen on, or they can only they're afraid to experience anything other than that. So they that's the only place they're willing to stay. But yeah, let's experience that. Let's get into that and just be like, wow, things are big things are afoot. Things are about to get weird, as you said in one of your recent pieces. And let's enjoy that as best we can. And at the same time, see that, our current culture, we could say in many ways, and including our attitude to technology, is in many ways deeply immature. And Daniel makes a very good case of that. And that it's if we decide that we care about, amongst other things, the future of biological life on this earth, which I hope we do, we can all have a say in that, then we've got some serious work to do, because things are not heading in the right direction as much as we might wish that they are. This or mixed with responsibility, maturity, is something that I try to sit with and exercise in healthy ways.
So actually, that brings me to the last place, because obviously you and I enjoy this kind of discussion. Otherwise we wouldn't be here. But what you just got to is where I feel like I've landed with respect to what the work really is. I realize I figured this out much sooner in my life. I'm on record talking about this stuff back in my 20s, and I had forgotten it at some point, which is simply that what seems to really matter most, rather than teaching people any particular thing or nudging people in any particular direction as far as the values are concerned is helping people remember how to play and how to exercise their curiosity in an environment where anxiety and fear and outrage and exploitation are steeply incented.
Yeah.
And that one can make an argument from so many different perspectives that, like, right now, when the narratives have failed us and the institutions are in doubt and we're off the rails as far as what we have is in a cohesive social fabric, what seems to matter most is high temperature search. So last thing quickly here would just be, what do you find most effective in helping people recover that awe and that curiosity and that playfulness that you're talking about here?
Yeah, I would maybe add to that a sense of what really matters in life. What are the things that are truly most important to you? I think, in my experience, all of those things go together. And I think it has a lot to do with the body, actually. It is embodied experience of one kind or another. And that actually helps us, or has helped me to discover that lightness and that playfulness and this motivation to continue working in the context of some quite gnarly stuff, to be honest. If we think about like the AI safety debate and climate change and so on, I'm so deeply grateful that I have had time to go on extended meditation retreats, that to do vision quests and similar, spending extended time in the wild, to have experienced plant medicine ceremonies. There are many, to name a few paths. You'll be familiar with these, probably many of your listeners will. Some of them won't be. But these kinds of practices that allow me to continue feeling a lightness and an ease and a flow in life, including by going all the way down to those most basic of questions of like, what is going on here and what is the nature of consciousness? I loved the conversation you had, Andres Gomez and Nielsen, actually. And I feel like you two are such a pair of big brains. Like, I was slightly terrified of coming onto this podcast having just listened to that. But that to engage in practices that take us like all the way down to that level, what the fuck, and where we really ask just what the fuck is going on here, always brings a smile to my face as well. So whichever practice that is, the people listening out there, don't forget about that. When was your last mushroom trip? When was your last extended meditation retreat? When was the last time you spent a few nights in nature without any electronic devices? Maybe it's time.
When was the last time you asked, what the fuck?
Right.
Dude, Stephen, I'm really grateful that we get to play on this course together, and thanks for taking the time today.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks again for listening. If you enjoyed that, links to the upcoming course and my latest writings can be found in the show notes, as well as a link to hire me as a consultant or advisor. Consultancy work is part of what helps fund all of the free public goods I produce with Future Fossils. So book some time with me. And then lastly, I'm excited to announce that How to Live in the Future, my first book of collected essays, is finally in the last yards of pre-publication with Revelor Press. And I will have a pre-sales page up for you soon. Keep your ear to the ground on that by subscribing to Substack or Patreon. That's it. Thanks a lot. Take care and stay tuned for upcoming conversations with Bill Cyril, Sarah Finn Huntley, Jamie Curcio, and Matt Segal.